When I turned 19, I was finally ready to buy my first car and get some independence from bumming rides off my roommate. I had a part-time job on campus, a shaky budget, and a hard limit of $2,500 because I still had to cover rent and food. I started treating Craigslist like a second job. Between classes, after shifts, and late at night, I scrolled through listings until my eyes hurt. I filtered by owner, set the max price, and read the same phrases too many times. Runs great, cheap commuter, no lowballers. Most of the decent cars were either overpriced or had obvious problems, but I kept searching anyway. One Wednesday night, I found a listing for a 2006 Mazda 3 with 140,000 miles, listed at $2,200. The photos showed a silver sedan parked on a residential street. The exterior looked clean, no visible rust or dents. The interior shot showed cloth seats that were worn but intact. The description said it ran fine, passed inspection last month, and just needed a new owner because the seller was moving out of state. I messaged immediately. The seller's name was Eric. He replied the next morning saying the car was still available and asked when I wanted to see it. I said I could come that evening after my shift. He sent an address in a neighborhood about 20 minutes from campus and said to text when I got there. I told my roommate Josh about it. He said he'd come with me to check it out. I was relieved. I didn't know much about cars, and having someone else there felt safer. We left around 6 p.m. The sun was still up, but the light was fading. The address took us to a quiet street lined with older houses. Some looked maintained. Others had overgrown yards and peeling paint. Eric's house was near the end of the block. It was a 2-story with faded siding and a detached garage. The driveway was empty. No Mazda. No car at all. I texted Eric that we were outside. He replied within a minute saying he'd be right out. Josh and I waited by my roommate's car. A few minutes later, the front door opened and a man walked out. Eric looked to be in his 40s, average build, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He waved and walked toward us. I introduced myself and Josh. Eric shook our hands and apologized for not having the car out front. He said it was parked in the alley behind the house because the driveway gate was broken. That seemed reasonable. Josh asked if we could see it. Eric said sure and gestured for us to follow him. We walked around the side of the house. The yard was cluttered with old furniture and tarps covering random piles. The back gate hung crooked on its hinges. Eric pushed it open and we stepped into the alley. I looked around. No car. The alley was empty except for trash bins and a few scattered boxes. I asked Eric where the Mazda was. He paused, then said he actually had it in the basement for safekeeping because someone had tried to break into it last week. He said he'd bring it up, but we'd have to wait inside while he got the keys and moved some stuff out of the way. Josh and I exchanged a look. That didn't make sense. Why would a car be in a basement? And why would we need to go inside? Eric noticed our hesitation. He said it sounded weird, but that the basement had a garage door that opened to the alley. He said his dad used it as a workshop years ago. He offered to show us if we wanted to see the setup first. Josh asked why he didn't just pull the car out before we got there. Eric said he didn't want to leave it unattended in the alley. He said the neighborhood had been having issues with theft. I didn't like it. The whole thing felt off. But I also didn't want to seem paranoid or rude. I had driven 20 minutes to see a car, and walking away without looking felt premature. Josh asked if we could just wait in the alley while Eric brought the car out. Eric said the basement door was stuck and he'd need help pushing it open from the inside. He said it would only take a minute. I was about to say we'd wait when Josh cut in and said we were fine waiting outside. Eric's expression changed slightly. Not angry, but annoyed. He said it was up to us, but it would be faster if we helped. Josh didn't budge. He said we'd wait. Eric stared at him for a second, then nodded and said he'll be right back. He walked toward a side door on the house and went inside. Josh immediately grabbed my arm and said we needed to leave. I asked why. He said something was wrong and that no one keeps a car in a basement. He said if Eric came back out, we'd make an excuse and go. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then we heard a voice from inside the house. It wasn't Eric. It was deeper, and it was calling up from below, like someone was at the bottom of a staircase. The words weren't clear, but the tone was sharp, like a question or a command. Josh didn't wait. He said we were leaving. We walked quickly back through the yard and around to the front of the house. We got in the car and Josh started the engine. As we pulled away, I looked back at the house. Eric was standing in the front doorway, watching us leave. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, he just stood there. Josh drove a few blocks before pulling over. He said he didn't like any of it. No car in the driveway or the alley. A basement with a garage door that supposedly opened to the alley, needing us to come inside to help. And then that voice calling from downstairs. I agreed. I told Josh I felt stupid for almost going inside. He said scammers count on people not wanting to seem rude or paranoid. He said that's how they get you to ignore red flags. When I got home, I checked the listing. It was still up. I reported it to Craigslist as suspicious and moved on. I didn't hear anything back. The next day, I told another friend what happened. She said she'd heard about scams where people lured buyers into basements or garages and either robbed them or worse. She said I was lucky to have Josh with me. A week later, I searched for the listing again. It was gone. I tried to find Eric's email or phone number in my messages. The thread was still there, but the contact information didn't work anymore. The email bounced back and the phone number was disconnected. I reported it to the police non-emergency line and gave them the address. The officer said they'd look into it, but didn't sound optimistic. He said without evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. He also said I wasn't the first person to report something strange at that address. That stuck with me. I wasn't the first. Other people had gone there, seen the same setup, and felt the same unease. Some probably left like I did. Others might not have. I eventually found a car through a dealership. It cost more, but I didn't have to worry about basements or voices calling from below. I also stopped using Craigslist for anything that required meeting someone alone or going to their property. Josh and I talked about that day a few times after. He said the thing that bothered him most was how normal Eric seemed at first. Friendly, apologetic, reasonable. It wasn't until the inconsistencies started piling up that the picture changed. No car in the driveway, no car in the alley, a basement with a garage door, needing us to come inside, the voice from below. Each detail alone might have an explanation, but together they formed something else entirely. I think about what would have happened if Josh hadn't been there, if I had gone alone and Eric had convinced me to step inside, if I had been too polite to say no, if I hadn't had someone else to validate that the situation felt wrong. I don't think I would have made it back out. That's the part that keeps me up sometimes. Not what happened, but what almost did. How close I came to walking into a basement because I didn't want to seem difficult or suspicious. How easy it would have been to explain away every red flag until it was too late. I'm grateful for Josh, for his instinct to leave, for his willingness to seem rude or paranoid if it meant staying safe. He didn't care about the car or the wasted trip. He cared about getting out. I learned that day that your safety is more important than someone else's convenience. If a situation feels wrong, you don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't have to stay to be polite. You just have to leave. We never found out what was really in that basement or who the other voice belonged to. And honestly, I'm glad. Some questions don't need answers. Some doors don't need to be opened. All I know is that I got in a car with Josh, drove away, and slept better at night. For a few days after, I kept expecting a text from a new number asking if I was still interested in the Mazda. It never came. When I drove past alleys or saw basement windows from the street, I thought about that voice calling up, telling us to come down. Sometimes I still wonder what was really waiting for us in that basement. And I'm glad I'll never know.
This story takes place in November of 2017, and I was 18 years old. I'm a very short woman, only about 4'10". I get anxious when someone even looks at me in a way that suggests they might not like me. So, needless to say, I'm incredibly non-confrontational. My friend and I were out shopping. It was something we'd do maybe every few months, just to bond, since we didn't have much time to hang out due to college. She's just like me, barely scraping 5'1" and very non-confrontational. It's probably why we became friends. On every shopping trip, we would find ourselves in an Ann Summers store. We're both overly endowed and struggled to find bras anywhere. Ann Summers always had great sales, so we grabbed the cheap bras while we could. This shopping trip wasn't any different. We browsed shops until we got to Ann Summers. But that's when things took a bit of a turn. I'd barely stepped foot into the shop when a woman with some sort of Slavic accent stopped me. Her finger jammed into my chest. "Spit the gum out," she demanded. Assuming that she was an employee, I gave a very sheepish, "I'm really sorry," and ran out of the shop to spit the gum out and throw it away. When I went back in, I realized that this woman was not an employee. She was a customer who was browsing and happened to be near the door when my friend and I entered the shop. It should have been obvious to me at the time. No salesperson would ever behave like that, not one that wanted to keep their job anyways. But I kept my head down when I walked past her, holding my breath in hopes that she wouldn't notice me again. She didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. My friend and I browsed the shop, trying to avoid the woman. But the shop wasn't very big, probably only 15 feet by 18 feet. So eventually I ended up at the sales stand by the door where she had been stood. I tried to keep my distance while browsing. I was looking at the price tags but realized that I didn't know what the discount was, so I leaned over slightly to check the discount sign. It's important that I note that this woman had a pushchair, which is a stroller for the Americans. And you'd think that she'd maybe had a child in this pushchair, but no. It was full of plastic carrier bags. I didn't look too much at it, but I could tell that everything in there was double-bagged and tied shut. Whatever was in those bags, she wanted to protect. This sense of protection became very relevant because when I leaned over to look at the discount sign, I was leaning slightly closer to her pushchair. I was still about 3 feet away from it, but apparently that was too close. The woman was on the other side of the chair, but the moment she saw me, she ran around to it where I was stood. She hit me. It was somewhere between a slap and a punch, and I couldn't quite tell because I was in shock. All I knew is that it hurt. "Watch the personal space," she hissed in my ear. And I apologized to her.
This woman just hit me, and I apologized to her. I regret it now, but at the time, I didn't want to provoke her any further. Not that I knew what I did to provoke her in the first place. And in my shock, I turned around and ran to the back area, grabbing my friend's hand and pulling her with me. The back area was separated by a tiny wall that only stretched halfway across the shop, since they stored the adult toys there and wanted to keep them out of sight of the general public. I stood there holding my friend's hand and shaking as I whispered, "She just hit me," to my friend. And we stood there for a good minute in silence. My friend was positioned in a way that she could see the rest of the store, while I hid behind the wall. "She's gone," my friend told me, and I let out a breath that I didn't even know that I was holding. "Can we stay here for a while?" I asked my friend, worried that the woman would be outside waiting for me. The front of the store was open, but she could have easily just been a couple of feet down the road and out of sight, waiting for me to leave. My friend agreed, and we slowly browsed the shop again. About 5 minutes later, we got to the counter to check out, and the girl working the counter looked outside and then back at us. "That woman's been in here for 30 minutes. I didn't know what to do," she told the two of us. "What did she say to you?" "She told me to spit out my gum when we first came in, and then she hit me because I was too close to her." "She hit you?" The worker was wide-eyed. "If I had have known that, I would have called security. I'm so sorry." I smiled and shrugged. "It's fine." It wasn't really fine, but it wasn't the worker's fault. She didn't look much older than I did, and I wouldn't have known what to do in that situation either. Still shaken up, my friend and I made our way out of the store. I looked around but didn't see the woman. "Can we just go home now?" I asked my friend. We hadn't finished browsing all the shops, but I was so paranoid that we'd bump into that insane woman again. She agreed, and we got the bus home. When I got home, my parents encouraged me to report the incident to the police. I called the non-emergency line, and their answer was basically, "Well, what do you expect us to do about it?" Unless I went back to the Ann Summers and requested the security footage, which I wasn't sure if they actually had, they wouldn't do anything. It's been just over 3 years now, and I'm sure that that woman was likely to have been homeless and/or on drugs. It's the only explanation I can think of for the carrier bags, her protectiveness. It was either everything she owned, or drugs, or maybe even both. When I was 17, I was looking to buy my first car. I was on Craigslist every single day, browsing through listings. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a beater car that could get me from point A to point B. My budget was $3,000 at most, so the cars I was looking at were no newer than 2004. I found an ad one day for a 2002 two-door Honda Accord. It was listed for $2,000, and the mileage was under 80,000. Right away, I knew I wanted to check it out. The person who posted the ad lived a few towns over from us, about a 20-minute drive on the highway. I convinced my mom to drive me out there to view the car after conversing with the guy over the phone. Originally, I texted him asking for details, but he ended up calling me instead. He sounded basically normal over the phone, actually rather polite. He answered some questions I had about the car and whatnot. When he asked for my name and I told him Dan, he said, "Dan, what a great name. That's my name too." I laughed because it was the polite thing to do, but I just found it to be such an odd comment. Everything about it felt off. It almost sounded like he forgot his name was Dan because of the pause between "what a great name" and "that's my name." It just sounded sketchy. Nevertheless, everything else about the call went fine. The next day, my mom drove me to the address the guy gave me. Getting off the highway and onto the streets, right away we agreed this was a trashy-looking neighborhood. Bars on windows, graffiti under bridges. I was hoping the guy's place wouldn't seem equally sketchy, but as we pulled up, it was. It wasn't a standard property like the rest in the area. The entrance to the property was between two houses. It wasn't a driveway, just some low-key road that led into an inlet with two more houses. Every house was cramped between other houses and buildings. But there I saw it, the Honda Accord, which was parked in what you'd call the driveway for this house. My mom and I stepped up to the front door and rang the bell. We didn't know if it rang or not because we couldn't hear anything, so I knocked. One of the windows opened out of nowhere, and a man's voice said to come inside. The door was unlocked. I went to open the door, and my mom stopped me. She whispered, "Are you sure you want to go in there?" I said, "Yeah." I let ourselves in, expecting to be greeted by Dan. The inside of this place was kind of dark. Not a lot of natural light came in through the minimal windows. "Hello?" I said. "Yeah, over here," a voice called. It was a deeper voice than I heard on the phone. "Dan?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. I began walking through the little kitchen closer to his voice. My mom grabbed my shoulder and stopped me. She whispered in my ear, "We're leaving." The man's voice now came from beyond this door at the end of the kitchen. He called up, "Down here, we can do the transaction here." My mom and I left the house in a hurry. As we were hurrying to my car, a lady at the next building over called to us. She came hurrying down from her front porch, warning us not to go in there. Then she asked why we were there, and we explained that I came to buy a car, but that he was calling us into his basement. The woman said that she'd been concerned about that man living next door for months. She thinks he's up to no good, and that he constantly has random cars pull up in the driveway in the middle of the night. We asked if his name was Dan. She said she wasn't sure, but that she vaguely remembered the guy introducing himself as Mike. She told us to just get far away from the house immediately, and so we did. It's disturbing to know my mom and I may have been murdered in that basement if we went down there. How could we do a transaction before even viewing the car or agreeing on anything? Better question, why in the basement? The whole thing screams trap. I don't know what else he could have wanted to do to us, more specifically me, in that basement. This wasn't all that long ago. It actually wasn't until after this happened that I even knew about the horrible encounters other people also had on Craigslist. I always thought it was relatively safe, so long as you were cautious enough. Apparently, I didn't follow my own rules though. This was during the first month that I moved into my new home. It was a pretty long move across the country into a relatively new area for me. I sold almost everything before the move, so for the first little while, I would casually scroll through Craigslist whenever I was bored, hoping to find anything I might need, mostly furniture or just things to make the house feel less empty. Before this, I had actually already found a few things on Craigslist and picked them up and had no issues at all. So I really didn't have much reason to be nervous. One night after work, I happened to scroll by a post of a fairly nice-looking couch. It was almost perfect to what I was hoping to find. A gray sectional sofa that was apparently in great condition, and it was all for a decent price, $200. The guy responded pretty quickly. His name was Brian, and from the text, he seemed like a chill dude. We agreed on the price and started figuring out the plan to meet up. The big issue was that I only had an SUV. It could maybe fit one section of the sofa at a time, and he lived in the next town over. So I would have to drive there and back multiple times just to get the whole thing to my place. When I mentioned that I didn't have a way to pick up the whole couch at once, he kindly offered to use his pickup truck to drop it off at my place. Of course, I ideally wanted to see it in person before buying it and didn't feel too comfortable with giving some random guy my address. But it was just so much more convenient and made a lot more sense to do it this way. And he wasn't pushy or weird about it in any way at all. He genuinely seemed like he was offering a solution. So, after a bit of thinking it over, I agreed. We were set for him to swing by my place at 5:30 on the following day. I went to bed early. In the morning, I sent him my address, then spent the rest of the day cleaning the other rooms of the house. Once it got closer to 5:30, I stayed in the living room and watched TV, leaving the blinds partially open. Almost at exactly 5:30, I saw headlights coming down the road. A few seconds later, a black pickup truck slowly passed by. As they did, I noticed that there was no couch in the bed of the truck. So I figured it was just a neighbor or something and continued waiting. However, just a few minutes later, that same truck passed by again. It was really strange the way they slowed down, like they were looking at my house or maybe even through the windows as they were passing by. It kind of just gave me an uneasy feeling, but I still figured it was nothing. I sent Brian a text, making sure he was still on his way, then continued watching TV. After I sent that text, I didn't see any more trucks passing by outside. Even more strange, though, was that Brian never texted me back. He never showed up or even updated me on anything. At 6:30, an hour had passed since when he was supposed to be here. I sent another text, only for it to not go through. That meant that he blocked my number. I didn't know what went wrong, but overall, I wasn't too concerned. I was more just bothered that he wasted my time. Maybe he found someone else who would pay more. Or something else came up, and he just didn't want to deal with giving me the bad news, so he ghosted me instead. It happens, I guess. As it got later into the night, I was mostly over it. I had dinner, set up my office room in the house, and chilled in bed watching YouTube for the rest of the night. I don't even remember falling asleep. I think I just passed out in the middle of a video. But I'm pretty sure I was out for at least a couple hours. I woke up in the middle of the night to a really unsettling sound. It was a long wooden creak, which I was absolutely sure was the front door creaking open. I knew it because it always bothered me, being the only squeaky door in the house. But who the hell just opened it? I sat up and stared toward my bedroom door as I listened. I could hear subtle footsteps moving into the house below me. I probably wouldn't have been able to hear them if not for the echo of the empty home. I felt myself start to panic, but I remained still, almost stuck in place. The footsteps seemed to stop as they reached the bottom of the staircase. Several long seconds of silence went by before a man's voice called out. Not just anything, though. He was calling out my name. His voice was deep and sounded like an older man, but I didn't recognize it as anyone I knew. He called out my name again. Disturbingly, there was no emotion behind it. He was monotone, just saying my name over and over from the bottom of the stairs, like he knew I was up here. I quietly reached for my phone to call 911. I was extremely scared that he would hear me talking to the operator, but honestly, I felt like I had no choice. I whispered as quietly as I could. The man still stayed at the stairs, calling out my name. Once the cops were on the way, I moved from my bed to my closet. I didn't know if the man was actually going to come up to look for me or not. Clearly something was wrong with him, so I wasn't taking my chances. Only 30 seconds after I moved into the closet, though, the man's voice stopped calling out. From the closet, I couldn't really hear anything else, like footsteps or doors. So I got really anxious, unsure where he was, or if he could be right outside my bedroom right now. Fortunately, in a couple minutes, officers arrived. The house was empty. Whoever that guy was that came in, he was gone. I immediately told the officers about the Craigslist situation because I was sure it had to be Brian. I mean, I had just given him my address that day and saw that truck suspiciously passing by earlier. I still had his phone number, so I felt confident they could track him down. But there were a few problems. When my messages weren't going through, it turned out it wasn't because he blocked me. It was because that number no longer existed. It was a dead line. There was no way to trace it back to him. And the second issue is that even if we figured out who he was, there wasn't any way to pin him from being the one that broke in. Still, I'm almost 100% sure it was the guy from Craigslist. I wonder if maybe he was planning to have me, or whoever responded to his listing, go to his place where he was more prepared to do whatever it was he was trying to do. But for some reason, he thought he could still follow through with it at my place by breaking in. Maybe he overestimated himself. I really don't know. It's also really strange that he stayed downstairs and just called out my name. Anyway, the cops said it looked like he picked the lock on my front door, so I replaced it and installed a camera. I didn't really have the option to move, so I'm trying to take any precautions necessary. Nothing has happened since.
Every once in a while, I find myself looking through sites like Craigslist, eBay, and other similar ones for random things I might want or need. It was kind of like online thrifting, just something fun to do. And sometimes it even got me great deals on stuff I wouldn't have bought otherwise. This was in 2018, so a pretty long while ago. I had found a few things on Craigslist that I was interested in. The listing showed a bin full of home decor, like candles and picture frames, and just cute decorations for around the house. My apartment was pretty bare bones, so I thought a bunch of random decorations could liven up the place. I messaged the woman, April, and she was super kind. Basically, she said she was moving and wanted to sell off all the stuff she didn't want or thought might break during the moving process. Her goal was just to get rid of it all, so she didn't mind selling them for dirt cheap. She said for $20 she would be happy to let me pick out whatever I wanted, or even everything if I wanted all of it. We agreed to meet at a nearby parking lot after she got out of work at 6 o'clock on a Thursday night. I got out of work at 5 o'clock that day, so I just went straight there from the office. The place we agreed on was a parking lot for a grocery store, which was pretty busy around that time. There were a bunch of people coming and going. I texted April what my car looked like and where I was in the lot, then just waited. It was the middle of winter, so I had the car blasting heat and was hoping she would get here sooner rather than later. But I got a text just a few minutes after I got there. It said she was getting out late and was hoping I could possibly meet up closer to her. Obviously, this was a bit frustrating, but she seemed really sorry. And if it ended up saving both of us time, then I guess it wasn't too big of a deal for me to drive a little bit more. April sent over the address to another parking lot that was closer to her, so I just put the address into my GPS and started driving there. I hadn't been over to that side of town very much, so I wasn't sure exactly where it was taking me. The drive was about 15 minutes. Even though it was only about 6:30 when I got there, because it was winter, the sun had already set and it was fairly dark out. But what made it even more dark was that all the buildings in the parking lot had their lights off. Essentially, it was a small lot for an outdoor strip mall, but it was empty and nobody was there except for one car parked on the far edge near the end of the parking spaces. Something felt off about it as I pulled in. April mentioned she had a red Toyota SUV, which was the one car that was parked over there, so I drove over and parked just a few spaces away. The contrast between the busy public parking lot she chose before to now this deserted, empty lot was really strange. I told myself I would just see how it goes since I was already here, and if anything makes me feel too weird, I would dip out. I got out and stood by my car, waiting for April to get out as well. I realized as I stood there, I couldn't see into her windows. They were maybe tinted, but also the lighting made it difficult to see through. But while I was standing out there in the cold,
I started to feel increasingly less comfortable. I was only out there for maybe 15 seconds before I was about to decide to get back in and leave when their door opened. But a man got out. He looked like he was in his 30s, with dark hair and a heavy tan winter jacket. He quickly explained that April couldn't make it and was held up at work still, so he was here to give me the stuff from Craigslist. I thought this was super weird and that I would have gotten a text if that was the case. It felt like that information was hidden from me until I had already showed up. In my hesitation to respond, he also mentioned that because of all the hassle, he would let me take everything for free if I would like. He smiled as he opened up the trunk and stepped back, motioning for me to come over and look. I didn't exactly know the best way to leave, but I was sure I was not going over there. Maybe if this were all in a more public place, I would be less skeptical. But out there, where nobody else was around, I was really unsettled. I quickly started going back into my car. As I said, I was just going to call April really quick, just to make sure. His smile faded as I walked back and got into my car. I opened my messages, then called April's number. A few seconds later, the muffled sound of a phone ringing came from outside. I looked over. He slowly reached into his pocket and ended the call. My stomach dropped. In an instant, he started hurrying up to my door as I turned my car on and sped out of there. I was almost sure that this was all a setup, and there never was anyone named April. It was likely that man behind it the whole time, just pretending to be an innocent woman selling decor in hopes to lure in other girls like me. I can only imagine what would have happened had I gone over toward the open trunk of his car. After that night, I called my sister to talk about what happened, and she told me to call the police, so I did. However, since nothing really happened, and there is technically no crime for pretending to be a girl named April, although suspicious, they couldn't do anything about it. To me, it's very clear this was a setup that likely had horrifying intentions behind it. I really just hope nobody else fell for it.
For the last several years, I have lived a normal life in the city. It's where I stayed pretty much all day, every day. I owned a condo just a couple miles from where I worked, so everything was very convenient. And there was no reason to leave the area. This week, however, I had a couple issues with my condo that were starting to really bother me. And hiring someone to fix them would have been way overpriced. But I had no tools myself. So to save as much as possible, I went on Craigslist to see if anyone was selling some secondhand toolkits. It was about time I got one. Anyway, surprisingly, there were a ton. Some were worse deals than others, but I just needed some basic stuff. So I kept looking until I found something that seemed decent. A lightly used toolkit with everything I needed for a respectable price. I sent an email, and within just 15 minutes, we were set to meet up. The guy said that I could come by his place and pick it up tomorrow, whenever I was available. I worked until 7, but I usually like to stay up anyway, so I was good with it. His address was pretty far though, at least for me. It was 45 minutes outside of the city in a very small town that I somehow had never heard of. On the satellite view of maps, it looked like just 100 or so houses clumped up in one area. Come the following day after work, I made the drive out of the city. The roads were pretty empty and honestly kind of nice once I was away from all the buildings. It was well past sundown when I started getting close. It looked like mostly wooded areas with just a few gas stations and shops around. The neighborhood I pulled into was sketchy to say the least. All the houses were mixed in with the forest, and they were clearly very old. They looked like they had been there for over 100 years and really hadn't had any renovations. Some looked abandoned for sure. This had me a little put off as I continued through the wooded road and finally got to the address the guy sent me. It looked no different than all the rest of the homes. Small, old, and barely standing. Although I felt a little uneasy about this neighborhood, it was in the back of my mind that I was very much from the city and wasn't used to places like this. so I thought it might have not been as bad as I was making it out to be. I parked on the end of the driveway and stepped out. Right away, I noticed how quiet it was. It was so quiet that it felt unnatural. No people outside, or sounds coming from any of the houses, or even cars driving by. Just dead silence. I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. As I stood on the porch and waited, I had this strange feeling that made me keep looking behind me. But after a minute, the door opened. The guy that answered was about average height, with longish brown hair and an unkempt beard. He definitely didn't look the most put together. He showed me inside and over to the living room, where sitting on the couch, there was a thick tool bag holding all the tools that he was selling. One thing that made the whole situation feel more eerie was that there were basically no lights on in the house. There was only a single lamp in the living room that barely produced anything more than shadows. Also, as we walked into the living room, I noticed the back door by the hallway was hanging on its hinges, like completely broken in the doorway, leading outside. I didn't exactly know what to look for when it came to the kid, but honestly, I just wanted to pay for it and leave. I pretended to look through it, but just pulled my cash out and turned around to hand it to him. When I noticed, he wasn't there. The room was empty. Where the hell did this guy go? I called out for him, but the house was extremely quiet. There were slight creaks coming from the walls and floors all around the house, but I couldn't tell if it was just the old house settling or not. I felt my adrenaline spiking. I think my gut knew this was really bad. I called out one more time for him as I slowly made my way back to the front door, leaving the tools behind. Just when I got into the hallway, though, someone was standing there. It was a different guy. I couldn't see him well because he was standing in the shadow, but I could tell he was noticeably taller and wider than the other guy. I was just heading to my car to grab some money, if that's all right, I said casually, hoping he would just move out of the way and let me go. He didn't answer. The way he was standing was like he was intentionally blocking the hallway. I stood there trying to think of what to do, but just a second later, I heard a creak to my right. I turned my head. The room beside me was pitch black. If I had to guess, I think it was the kitchen, but it was honestly so dark in there that I couldn't tell. Somehow, in that moment, my survival instincts just kicked in, and I sprinted to the broken back door I remembered seeing. As I ran out of the house, I heard several loud creaks that definitely sounded like footsteps running behind me. Thankfully, the house didn't have a fence, so I was able to just run right around and back to the front. As I was running back up to my car, someone jumped out from behind it and started running away. I didn't know what they were doing, but I knew I had to leave, so I just unlocked it and got in, then floored it out of there. I was still under the adrenaline rush for a while after that. I'm pretty sure there were multiple people in that house, and that one of them was trying to either break into my car or prevent it from running so I couldn't get away. I can't say exactly what they intended to do, but if I didn't get out when I did, I'm not confident I ever would have.